Okay, so we might get started, everybody. Thank you all for joining us on campus. It's lovely to see so many people here today and everybody online. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Monagle clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Today, our feature author is Professor Louise D'Arcens, talking about her new book, World Medievalism, the Middle Ages in Modern Textual Culture. And we'll stick with the same format that we've been following for the last few seminars. And she will be in conversation with Associate Professor Clare Monagle. And Clare, can I hand over to you? Actually, before I do that, the format will be, we'll just hear from Louise and Clare for about the next 40 minutes, and there will be an opportunity for questions for our author at the end, so probably about 10 minutes or so towards the end of the session. So thanks, Clare.
Thank you. Hi everybody on screen. I can't see your faces, people on screen, but hello. And thanks to those who came in person as well. It's actually really nice to see your faces. I'm really delighted to be, I was very delighted to be asked to speak to Louise about this book because it's a wonderful book. And I also wanted to say, I've been thinking about this lately, that as you get more mature in your academic career, one of the things that nobody told me about was the pleasure of seeing people who who've known for a long time, and I've known Louise for about 15 years now, the pleasure of watching people increasingly flourish and really, really get to that point of sort of, it's a problematic word, but really getting to that point of mastery. It is one of the delights of getting older that no one told me about, but it's fantastic. And this book is the book, World Medievalism, the Middle Ages in Modern Textual Culture. This book is, because I've known Louise and her work for a long time, personally, what is so delightful about this book is I really feel like it synthesises very elegantly, very articulately, it synthesises the quite extraordinary array of interests and capacities that Louise has, but it never feels like it is crammed full. It doesn't feel like it needs to be Marie Kondo'd, not at all. The book is spare, precise and elegant, and I do think that capacity of bringing together thoughts and ideas and sensitivities that have developed over years, bringing them together is one of the loveliest sort of achievements, I guess, of becoming more senior. And this book is so precise in terms of narrating a field, carving out a territory, which I know is completely problematic metaphor given the claims of this book. But it really is I think it's just a phenomenal achievement. So I'm just delighted to be here today, and I'd encourage everybody to read it, even if it's not your area, because of the really excellent modelling it provides on talking about philosophical and scholarly and literary method that is perfectly apposite to content. There's this beautiful balance between Louise's theoretical approach and what she wants to cover, what she's talking about. It's just really seasoned in that way. And so I just think, I'd recommend it to anybody as a beautiful example of writing and scholarly work, as well as doing, I know it will, and it is doing already, really important work in the field of medievalism studies and medieval studies more generally. And I should explain that I'm a medieval historian who has also worked on some of the same areas as Louise. I really want to encourage everybody to read this book. It's available online in the library at the moment, so just do yourself a favour, as Molly would have said. You don't have to pay. So I'm going to ask Louise some questions about the book, and I have a lot of questions about the book that are related actually to sort of quite precise issues in medieval and medievalism studies, and I'm not going to ask those today because that's not what this session is for. So I'm going to ask Louise some questions that I hope will enable her to give a sense of how the book works, what it thinks about and how it thinks, but also ask questions in a way that enable her to actually carve out just some of the core terminology that not everybody will be familiar with. So the first thing I wanted to get Louise to speak about is when I first saw that it was called World Medievalism, my first thought was, why not global medievalism, which has become, in terms of medieval studies, in terms of myriad forms of historical inquiry, be they literary or historical, there has been, for many, many good reasons, a turn to the global, and that is the much more common word. Just seeing world medievalism is really striking. It makes me think about Woe Madeleine and world music.
Yep.
Louise offers a really, really interesting and generative account of why she decided to talk about world medievalisms rather than global. And so I hope that you can address that, Louise, and perhaps also offer one of your really pithy explanations of what medievalism is, just in case anybody doesn't know.
Yeah, thanks so much, Claire. And so, first of all, thank you for saying senior and mature so many times in that introduction. I'm getting used to those adjectives, slowly. So thank you so much for that. No, they are good. They're good adjectives. So just medievalism, I just recycle my same definition across all of my work at this point. So, but just as a kind of a shorthand for people who are unfamiliar with what medievalism describes as a term, it's really, it works from the principle that the Middle Ages has had a long afterlife, basically, that it continues to resonate in modern culture and to influence modern culture, and also that it's a period that I think it's a historical period, of course, the Middle Ages, but it's also a period that's generated a very powerful imaginative afterlife. And so medievalism is basically that afterlife, and it's about sort of reinterpretations, receptions, reenactments, and so that idea that the Middle Ages continues to live on as a modern phenomenon. The Middle Ages lives on as a phenomenon through medievalism. So that's a kind of it's not very pithy, but it's a very, very large phenomenon. So that's about as pithy as I can get.
And you all know the example, of Game of Thrones, you're all very familiar with medievalism, even if you haven't heard that.
Yeah,
word.
Once you know about it, you see it absolutely everywhere. It becomes completely ubiquitous. And so that's medievalism. So you're right about world being a tricky title, so world medievalism, and anybody who's in the field of literary studies or generally cultural studies is aware that this term world is a tricky term, and I went in with my eyes open, and I'm expecting some pushback. When people read my book, hopefully, and start reviewing it, I am expecting some questions because it is a term that has become associated, people may well be aware of this, it has become associated with a kind of Eurocentric idea of a kind of a generous extension into the world beyond Europe, but always through the lens of knowability that's kind of a Western or Eurocentric sort of frame. And so it's a term that still carries for many people a charge of kind of Eurocentrism. And I mean charge as in like an indictment, but also that kind of the energy of Eurocentrism. And so it's a tricky term for me to have used, and I thought about whether I would. But I decided not to go with global, which has, as Claire's rightly said, been the term that many people have used around medievalism and around the global Middle Ages. I decided not to go with it for a couple of reasons. So the first one is there's been some very, very interesting work that's been done in the field. And so if I can just sort of walk back for 1 second, as Claire was saying, one of the things about medieval studies as a field, and I think this is not just limited to medieval studies, certainly classical studies is thinking about this as well, is how do we think about coeval cultures across the kind of global, across the world? How do we think about the idea that other things were happening, not just in Europe, in this period, this 5th to 15th century period that we call the Middle Ages? And when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're talking about what's middle, what's it in between? And so it's in between the kind of shorthand it's between, the fall of Rome and the kind of the Renaissance or the early modern period. And so for you to buy into the concept of the Middle Ages, you have to buy into not just a European framework, but actually a kind of a Roman-centric, a kind of a particular part of Europe's narrative. And so the debates in the field have been asking the questions of how do we understand the plurality of cultures and their intersections and their interactions in that time. And so the term that people have been settling on is global. And to try to capture within that, I think, an idea of cultural exchange, of trade, of linguistic and religious intersections. And it's a really fertile re-examination of how we understand the period. But some of the critiques of that, I think, of it as a term, have been, I think, in my view, fairly compelling. And the ones that I've been most influenced by are the ones that have said, look, the difficulty around coming up with the idea of global Middle Ages is that it runs the risk of offering basically a reifying or justifying narrative for contemporary globalisation, as though there's always been this kind of teleology, this arc leading up to the contemporary global that started way back then. And so we have to be quite careful about what it is about our moment now that we justify by invoking the global in the past. And so I found that a pretty compelling warning around what it means to use the term global. And so that's my kind of, my reason for shying away from the global. Then I have a kind of a positive reason for wanting to use the word world. And that is, as you've been talking about, I've sort of introduced some theoretical sort of frames within the book. And one of the things that I've been really, really interested in as somebody thinking about how we relate to the past in modern culture and how we relate particularly to a more distant or pre-modern past. I've been interested in that as an experiential phenomenon. So not just say as a kind of an ideological experience or something. It's something when people come into contact with the past, they actually have a kind of an emotional, cognitive, phenomenological kind of apprehension of the past that they're, coming into contact with. And so I've been pretty influenced by phenomenology in that respect and trying to think about the contact of with the past through the framework of phenomenology. And through that, I became very interested in the term, from Heidegger, but other people use it as well, which is world disclosure. And this idea that when we come into contact with the past, we experience some sort of apprehension of what we take to be a world. And again, I'm not saying that this is historically accurate. In fact, I'm saying probably that in many cases it's driven by a kind of an emotional engagement that's not historicist. And so I wanted to capture that element of medievalism, the fact that the Middle Ages is often this very powerful imaginative category for people rather than a historical period. So I'll stop there because I'll just keep going on about what this choice, but that's kind of what was behind it.
And I think there's a spot in the book where you also talked about how, and I think you went close to saying this, but you do talk about how when we use global, it's almost like if there was a medieval globe, it's like we're just trying to find modernity earlier.
Exactly.
And so it
Well
continues, that continues that periodisation.
Yeah.
One thing that always makes me laugh about the term global is if you look up the Flat Earth Society on the internet, they say we have members across the globe. So
across though, not around, not around, but across the globe.
So if even the Flat Earth Society can't do without the globe,
the metaphor of the globe, it's a powerful one.
I was completely convinced by the world idea, particularly through your argument or your discussion of the idea of I can never say it, the phenomenological method, which you describe as in opposition to an ontological method. And I was just wondering, what did you mean by ontological method?
Oh, don't do that.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. No,
I think I might have. It was more that I was. Empirical method was really probably what I was contrasting it with, an empiricist approach to the historical past. And I was trying to think about, I think the opposing terms that I was using were comprehension and apprehension and phenomenology as opposed to a sort of, to a more sort of, the word's gone out of my head now, but,
that makes sense.
But
so you could also say sort
Yeah.
of affective. I mean, you don't use that word much, but it's sort of an affective, not necessarily precognitive, but it's a response we can't control.
Well, I just think that you see that in medievalism. So much medievalism is deeply emotive about what the author or the creator thinks the Middle Ages is, and it's and we see that in medieval scholarship. I mean, that's been one of the debates in the field too, is how, to what extent do we still see that apprehension creeping into even quite densely historicist and empirical scholarship. Yeah.
That's very helpful. And I think the introduction really maps this stuff out. I've got to stop using these awful world...
It's impossible.
All these metaphors, but really explains world. And you have completely taken it away from Womadelaide for me now.
Oh, good.
World. And I'm thinking of it in a really different way. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about global, which is interesting too, is that you talk about how global always implies interconnectedness for something to be global. But lots of interesting things happen that are not necessarily about connection as well. So it enables you to sort of think about discrete places as well as trade and networks.
Yeah.
Which I really liked as well. So the book is divided into four chapters, each of which deals with a different case study. And the first chapter is about I guess we would say it's a bit crude, but to sort of look at discourse around the Middle Ages in France, particularly in literary novels that have come out really in the past 20 years, some of which have been argued to be reactionary, some of which maybe not reactionary, but still evoking a similar sense of the medieval past. So there's France. The second chapter deals with Tariq Ali's Islam Quintet, which is 5 novels about, not entirely about the Middle Ages, but mostly about Islamic world in the Middle Ages, mainly in Spain, but also Sicily. The third chapter, which is probably the funniest, is about, and it's really striking, it's about the discovery of a skeleton about 20 years ago, which has become known as the Homo floresiensis, which is found on the island of Flores in Java, and which was started being called very, very early a hobbit. And Louise tracks how this skeleton became known as the Hobbit, and not just by the popular press. Like scientists were very implicated in this process. And the fourth chapter, which is probably the most, most ambivalent and really, really thoughtful, is about the 2006 film 10 Canoes, a collaboration between Rolf de Heer and the Yolngu people of the Arnhem Land. So I'm just going to ask, I think the most important one to speak about is probably the last one, so I'll see how we go for time. But I've got a question about each chapter, and I've picked out a sort of sentence that I think, this really opens up what you're doing. So on the French novelists, and the one most of you will have heard of is Michel Houellebecq. I actually hadn't heard of the others. Louise has a lovely quote where she's describing the difference between 19th century French medievalism, which is kind of about nation building, particularly sort of post-revolutionary nation building, to describe this kind of elegiac 21st century medievalism. And she says, it's a beautiful phrase, a nation is not a world but is of the world, which I thought was lovely in a way of situating this French medievalism in moving towards trying to understand France in the world rather than trying to constitute Frenchness. And so I was just wondering if you want to speak a little bit about those novels.
I did cover a range of novels. I'll sort of summarise one group of them, which is I was interested. Well, first of all, Michel Houellebecq was interesting to me. He's a very controversial novelist, and some people feel that he shouldn't be given oxygen. I was interested in him because he captured for me, he's a very difficult novelist to pin down in terms of what his ideological convictions or commitments are, but he certainly flirts very hard with right-wing thought in France. And I was interested in his novel because it's fascinating to me the number of right-wing thinkers who go to the Middle Ages as a way of talking about nationhood, and of talking about nationhood in a way that's directly responding to globalisation, particularly globalisation as understood as migration. So these are novels. His novel is very much one that's whether or not he's committing to the position, he's certainly giving us a protagonist who commits to the position that that the medieval France offers the essence of that nation. And of course that is a moment where the Middle Ages that he invokes is the one that has been at war with Islam and has defeated Islam. Right, so he invokes not the Crusades, but earlier conflicts between France and Islamic invaders, as it were. That's just please note that I'm quoting, who've come up through Spain. And so he sort of invokes that particular idea of the Middle Ages, and then I was sort of interested in sort of counterexamples, like people like Jerome Ferrari and Matthias Sénart, who push back against that Welbeckian vision of the Middle Ages and present a Europe that's always been in a kind of a very sort of, in the case of Sénart, a very amorous relationship to the Islamic East, and in the case of Ferrari, he has a very complex vision of France as a country that sort of, how do I explain this? It missed its opportunity to be Rome, but then it revisits that missed opportunity through its colonial empire in North Africa. And so it's always tying together ideas about post-Roman France with contemporary France. All three of the novels do it in these quite different ways. And so I was just interested in, why is it that the Middle Ages, why does this period always come to people's attention as a way of trying to understand contemporary nationhood, particularly in a very, very fractious political environment?
And you're very, you're really engaging in even though the sort of the ideology or the political points of these novels are quite distinct, you really trace a profound, I don't want to say the word melancholy necessarily because that's been co-opted, but you trace this kind of sense of something being lost. None of them are invested in the glorious French Republican tradition.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing too. They sort of see medieval France as, and post-Roman France, because they're sort of going across quite a big swathe of time across the three novels, as this kind of lost time, as a missed opportunity for a greatness that France never quite achieved, And so there's and Eric Zemmour, who I should just quickly mention, he's completely toxic, by the way. But after I wrote this chapter and after the book came out, he decided to run in the French election. And so he's a kind of a right-wing pundit who again has this very melancholic idea about France. And so, and it's, this idea of the Middle Ages is directly tied into Islamophobic politics in contemporary France. And so I think I was just interested in the way in which this period just does so much really pointed ideological work in sort of particularly in right-wing politics. Yeah.
And it's so potent in France that even people who are not on the right feel the need to engage with these accounts.
Yes.
To some degree.
That's right.
Then the next chapter is on these Tariq Ali novels, which Louise has told me, she doesn't say it in the book, but she doesn't think they're great novels.
From a literary perspective, they're not my favourite. But they're great. They make for great analysis.
Yes, they work very well. Yeah. But one thing I thought was really interesting is it's when you begin describing why Ali decided to write these novels, that's when you go back to a bit of Heidegger and you talk about the notion of Stimmung, of attunement, and I thought that was really great. And this goes throughout the book, that sense of you're engaging with the way it's not the past, it's the past resonances, how it feels, what it does, how it works. So that's another great little section to read if anyone's interested actually in Heidegger, to understand Heidegger made understandable for someone like me. So one of the things that's interesting though in the chapter on Ali's novel, so for those of you who don't know, he's a British public intellectual, Pakistani British public intellectual, leftist, and he's in the London Review of Books, and he's one of those public intellectuals in England who I'm sure many of you will know about his work. One thing that's really interesting is you are ambivalent about these books as world medievalism, and you say that perhaps actually it's better to think of them in terms of diaspora. And I'm just wondering, again, if you could just pass the difference.
Okay, so, oh gosh.
Sorry.
I should have looked at the chapter again before I came. Look, I think one of the things I was trying to do in the book is also just, I think, trying to mobilise a whole series of terms that I think would be useful intersecting terms. And so I think one of the reasons I wanted to think about it in terms of diaspora is because I had to be quite careful about the fact that that Ali, even though he's Pakistani born, he's very much understood through the context of the British left, right, and British public intellectual culture, as you say. So I wanted to think about him as a diasporic figure rather than as somebody who was like, sort of bona fide Middle Eastern writer. And it's partly because also one of the things that I'm very conscious of in my book is that I'm writing about English language, Anglophone and Francophone stuff. And so which is exactly what people critique when they talk about world literature. So I was conscious of that. But I think I'm where I'm not, I wouldn't say that I'm ambivalent about the books. I would say, apart from not always loving the style and some of the sexual politics, but I think one of the things that's really interesting about the books that probably leaves them open to a little bit of a charge of certain forms of romanticism is that he buys quite strongly into an idea about the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, which if people are unfamiliar with it, it's called the conviventia myth or the conviventia theory. And this is just an idea. So conviventia, living together happily. It's a theory around particularly Al-Andalus, so Muslim Spain, and the larger Islamic world, particularly Sicily, that this was this kind of completely tolerant culture in which Muslim rule allowed people to thrive in this kind of co-religionist way in a complete sort of equality, and it's a very, very attractive idea about the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, but it's also very much aligned with, on his part, a commitment to, I think, trying to change people's minds about the Islamic world, particularly because he's writing in the period of the First and Second Gulf Wars, right? So I think, I'm very drawn to conviventia ideas myself, so I have to confess to feeling the same Stimmung as him, this kind of, and I'm obsessed with Andalusia, I have to say. If I could go there tomorrow, I would. It's one of my favourite parts of the world. So I think there's a kind of, he's very attracted to that period, but also he doesn't examine that myth at all. It's part of what he does in the books, is he buys completely into that myth. And he tells a really great story in a sort of companion book of his called Clash of Fundamentalisms, which he wrote during the first Gulf Wars. And he was, or oil wars, as he calls them. And he talks about how he was watching TV and he hears somebody say, the Islamic world has no history and no politics, which is a totally offensive thing to say. And unsurprisingly, he responded with offence to that. And so the books are kind of motivated by that experience of offence that he had. So I think from the point of view of what he does with that idea of the Islamic world, it's not sort of a broken down idea. It's a defence of that world in a kind of a particular political climate.
And in that sense, you're keen to sort of eke out the diasporic aspects of it, because it's partly about him. He does have a more kind of explicit ideological axe to grind in relationship to identity in Britain than some of the other people we're talking about.
And the other element that's diasporic about it, just to say very briefly, is just that the idea of conviventia, of the Islamic conviventia, is a diasporic one. Yeah. So it's this kind of culture that's kind of come out of the Arab Peninsula and has kind of spread like wildfire through North Africa and up into Spain, etc.
And explicitly cosmopolitan.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. We've now, of course, I thought I didn't have enough questions, but of course that's never right. So we've got time to talk about one of the other chapters.
Okay.
And I would love to hear about both of them, but I think I would. Which one would you prefer to talk about?
I don't mind. Which one? Which one do you think would?
Well, I think what I'll just say is, I think I'll get you to talk about the hobbits because it is really entertaining. I will just say the last case study on 10 Canoes is, I think, really essential reading, but it's very, very thoughtful and subtle and precise, and I don't want to do that now because I'd like to do it justice, but I will say that what's really striking about what Louise does in that chapter is she sits with the profound complication of talking about Indigenous non-Western time and temporality through Western periodisation, and doesn't actually make a claim for doing it one way or the other.
Well, maybe I should just talk about the 10 Canoes chapter briefly, just to sort of say to people, because you might be going, what the hell is it doing in there? Why is 10 Canoes in a book on medievalism? And it was a bit of a thought experiment, as you say. And again, when I say thought experiment, I don't think Indigenous texts are there to be treated as thought experiments. So that's not what I did. But I think I was intrigued by the fact that Rolf de Heer, it was kind of a throwaway comment, but it got taken up and put into all this educational literature around the film, described the film as having been set 1,000 years ago. And as somebody who works on, 1,000 years ago, and particularly associate that with the 11th century, and therefore with kind of, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon world, which is now a term that's become a very, very fraught one. I began to think about, what does that mean for him to have invoked a time period that's kind of this one that we immediately insert into Western temporality, when he was talking about a deeply ancient culture. And so I just began to sort of think about, well, what would an Indigenous Middle Ages be? And of course that became a totally impossible thing. It's impossible to talk about that, but at the same time it led me to look at all those sorts of interesting things, like the discovery of East African Islamic coins from the 12th century and 13th century in Arnhem Land, or in the islands above Arnhem Land. And so began to sort of think, well, where does the medieval world cut out? Like, when does it stop? Can Northern Australia be part of the medieval world, given we now have admitted, the Indo-Malay region? Do we now admit Northern Australia? Yeah. So it's a kind of a thought about at what point do we say the medieval world cuts out? So,
and you also make really clear that we just cannot settle at all periodisation, because the way that you talk about Indigenous temporality also exposes the lie of the medieval as well. Yes. So that's the kind of confrontation at the end. But what's great is you don't sort of say, ergo, no more medieval, because this book is not about how things should be. It's actually about resonances, how things are, how they act, how they do.
And the inadequacy of the terms that we use, but the necessity to use them.
Yep.
So I think that's the difficulty about the idea of the medieval, is that once you get beyond Europe, it becomes a kind of a redundant and inappropriate, a kind of in all kinds of ways, a really inadequate term. But it's also a very, very helpful term, and one that kind of gives us a gathering point to understand time. So that's the trick of the difficulty of it.
And we all live in medievalism, and that is, that is kind of genuinely global and world.
And I think that's why they chose The Hobbit. My argument around, I know we've got to probably wrap up, but just to say very briefly that the reason why I was interested in The Hobbit, and why on earth did people decide to describe a female Asian Paleolithic skeleton as a male European pseudo-medieval creature? So that was, again, a kind of an intriguing thing for me. And
it went so viral.
Yeah, and it was completely viral, and scientists, it's right through really, really top-notch scientific journals as well. It's not just...
one of the paleoarchaeologists wanted to call it Homo hobbitus, and it was genuinely considered that being its taxonomic name.
Yeah, and he didn't get it across the line. He was always quite sad about that. But I guess the main point that I was just trying to make in that chapter is that that we have temporal imagination, is a real challenge for us. How far back can we think through time when it just becomes too difficult to understand what the past means? And the medieval often kind of steps in. And I think in the case of Homo floresiensis, The Hobbit, the Southeast Asian Hobbit, the medieval kind of stepped in as something that invokes a really deep past, but is kind of a manageable past. So the medieval often stands in as this thing that's close enough to be in focus, but far enough away to allow imagination and myth and legend, so it's kind of sits there as a deep time, but not too deep.
Yeah, I think, if the last chapter about 10 Canoes is about ambivalence, the chapter about Homo hobbitus is one where you just nail it in terms of like an argument. You say, where basically the point is people are dependent on this because we actually have a poverty of imaginative possibilities for thinking about what is referred to as prehistoric or deep time.
That's Westerners, by the way.
Yes, excuse me. Me.
Yeah, we us.
I'm the one with the poverty. That's a very good clarification. Look, I could keep going, but I think we should open up to questions right on time. I think that, I hope that you can tell from the conversation how engaging the book is, and also how naughty it is, but it's naughty without being obfuscating. And again, I think that's very, very hard to do, to give people a sense of really complicated ideas, but not in a way that leaves you floundering as a reader. I mean, I hope that, I know this work pretty well, so maybe that's my impression because I have more knowledge, but I feel quite confident actually that what I'm saying about its lucidity and its complex accessibility, I feel pretty confident that that's the case with this book. It's really, I do think it's really marvellous, but I will open up to questions.
Claire.
Fantastic. I could quite happily listen to the two of you talking about this for far longer, but we will run out of time if we're not careful. So we have the technology available to us for everyone online to actually be heard here in the room. So if you feel game and would like to ask a question, if you could put your little hand symbol up, I'll try and get round to you. And while you're figuring that out, are there any questions from the floor? We've had a couple of comments. So the book sounds wonderful. So I guarantee you will get a sales spike.
Oh, good.
So let me just make sure that I can see everybody here. Yes, I can.
This is what happens when I'm at parties.
Okay. Bridget,
everybody needs a drink all of a sudden.
We have a question from Bridget. So we can hear you, Bridget.
Thank you, Andrew. And Claire, I must say that was a wonderful conversation, and I think we're seeing not just Louise, but really two scholars who really are at the height of their powers. I wondered, Louise, if there was anything that you really wanted to include in this book. Was there another sort of case study that you were grappling with at any point that you were thinking of including, and then perhaps you didn't have within the, Claire very nicely described this book as sort of spare and concise. Was there anything you cut out at any point?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Bridget. I think that there were some novels that I would have liked to have included that I didn't. There's a wonderful, wonderful novel that I'm going to just do as a separate article, I think. As I mentioned before, the novelist Matthias Enard, who I would just commend to everybody. If you can read French, he's amazing in French, but he's great in English, really well translated. And he wrote a novel called Street of Thieves, which was such a fantastic book, and it's exactly the sort of stuff that I've been talking about, where he's a Persianist and an Arabist he's a professor, but as well as a novelist. And he wrote this wonderful novel in which the protagonist of it is a young Moroccan man who ends up being basically a refugee, so in Spain, on the Street of Thieves, which is an actual street in Barcelona. And what he does as somebody who's basically an undocumented worker is he compares his own life to Ibn Battuta, who's a very, very famous medieval traveller who was also, also Moroccan, and sort of, again, kind of romanticises what this medieval traveller's life was like compared with his very, very impoverished state of being and this kind of his status as an illegal. And it's just such a wonderful novel, but that chapter was already so crammed full, and I really felt like I was kind of on the border of not doing justice to my novels if I kept trying to cram them in, so I left that one out. Look, there's lots of other things now that that's sort of come along since I finished the book. In particular, there's been some really interesting stuff that's been done. Well, it's actually been done before I wrote the book, but some amazing sort of TV shows. I don't know if you know The Detectorists, this beautiful series, British series about people who use metal detectors to find artefacts under the soil, and it's a really lovely meditation, I think, on what little England or Little Britain could be, but also the way in which an identification and a very powerful emotional connection to soil doesn't have to be a nationalist practice. So I think that I would love to have talked about that, but these are going to have to all be separate articles. They're kind of conference papers that I hope I can work up into something else eventually.
I think you made the right call. I think
it would have been overstuffed, I think. Yep. Yeah. Did you have a good... I think there were some questions over here. Yep.
So when you were sort of deciding what to put into the book, was it did you have your chapter ideas already and then you sort of built them, or did you have things that you really wanted to talk about and then build a chapter around them?
Yeah, I think I probably started. I think, as Claire sort of said, I range really, I range widely in the things that interest me, and I think I kind of collected things that I'd been really interested in along the way, and I think it was one of those situations for me where it was only after I'd been sort of working on this, then this and that I began to kind of notice the preoccupations that kept returning, and that I was thinking about these questions of how we understand the past in a kind of a global framework, and it kind of crept up on me. And I think there kind of came a moment where I sort of thought, these things are quite disparate from each other, but I do think there's an overarching set of questions that are returning within them. And I think at that point I felt like I had something resembling a book, but I think then I had to sort of spend a lot of time thinking, well, how do these separate chapters speak to each other, and what do they coalesce into? And I think that's part of the kind of trickiness of the book, and as I say, I'm lapping up the praise here, but I'm expecting, that in some review contexts that people might say, well, there's a lot of different things in this book, and what are they? And so in some respects, they're all quite different case studies that take us back to the central problem. So I think what I did was I built back to the central problem through a case study approach. Yeah.
And also I think you produce cohesion through methodological practice as well. So it might not look like a coherent sample when you just line up the things, but methodologically each area responds to your method of reading in a way that really holds it together.
Well, thank you, Claire. That's what I was aiming for. I like thinking around problems, maybe, rather than starting with a problem and then kind of just prosecuting it endlessly through the same kind of set of texts. Yeah. Was there somebody else? Yep.
Yeah, and I think I'm still trying to figure out exactly what this question is, but I really love the idea that the medieval is stand-in for a past that is sufficiently distant but still accessible. That's, in a sense, what much nostalgia does. I just wonder if it's significant for you that the Hobbit skeleton is filtered initially through this fictional term. But one with a kind of hidden deeper history, the word hobbit, it's hobgoblin and the other things.
Yeah.
Of course, hobbits for Tolkien and his readers are meant to be intimately familiar Yes, the dynamic here is something that's familiar, but we don't quite know why. And then once we get into the actual specificities of its familiarity, that's when we can actually start to understand why we might be nostalgic.
Yeah, and the thing about The Hobbit too is that The Hobbit is a kind of an intimate, you know, they're kind of endearing, and again they kind of are kind of containing figures. They're kind of endearing and what's the word I'm looking for? They're
kind of benign.
Benign. Yeah, and approachable. So I think, look, there's really interesting things about that choice of The Hobbit. I mean, let me just say, at one level, it's total happenstance, because when they actually unearthed this these set of remains, the Peter Jackson movies were on the screens, and so in all sorts of ways, the Tolkien imagination via Jackson was part of the global imaginary at that particular moment. So it was kind of happenstance. But there were all sorts of other really fascinating serendipities that came along the way, which was that Henry G, for instance, who was the editor of Nature, Nature Journal, was actually writing a book on the archaeology of Middle Earth, or the science of Middle Earth, in which he did a chapter on the archaeology of Middle Earth. And he's being really careful, because when he was writing that book, the Hobbit story had not yet gone through full refereeing and was about to break within Nature Journal. He couldn't quite mention it, so he's kind of referring to these contemporary discoveries of ancient skeletal remains that, in a footnote, that reminded him of Tolkien, and I think that he was sort of interested also in alternative ideas about human evolution that were not kind of linear ideas of human evolution, and he found the kind of Tolkien idea of all this kind of multi-species Middle Earth spoke to his the sorts of theories of evolution that he was interested in. And so this Hobbit just kind of came along at a moment where all of these sort of ideas about evolution and ideas about public ideas about the Middle Ages all kind of just came to rest on this tiny little skeleton that became this kind of lightning rod for how people were trying to think about the deep past. And I think the Middle Ages, because particularly the Middle Ages has been a vehicle of fantasy, and this might be closer to answering what you were asking, fantasy as a vehicle, fantasy fiction, has that kind of fuzziness around it. Sort of alludes to something that's almost medieval, but is in that kind of mythic, legendary mode. And the Middle Ages, again, as a period, sort of supports that fuzziness, or it attracts that fuzziness and expresses it. And so I think it's not just the Middle Ages that's evoked in Homo floresiensis or The Hobbit, it's actually the fantasy Middle Ages. And so I think that it had to go through that kind of fantasy Middle Ages, because it's not a historical medieval that's embodied in that or evoked in the figure of the Hobbit.
And as a little footnote, when they found the skeleton, it was initially dated as being around 18,000 years old, which meant it would support the idea of different human species being on Earth at the same time.
Yeah.
It's subsequently been dated another 100,000 years before, so now it doesn't fit. So it's just really interesting that it was that question of dating. It was so constitutive to some scientists' vision.
Yeah.
Of evolution, and now, I mean, and the name now doesn't work so well for that, but the name's gone.
Yeah, they thought it was 18,000 years old, and they got really excited because they thought that it was coexisting with what are we called again?
Homo sapiens, Homo erectus.
Say Homo eroticus for some reason. What is that? Homo sapiens, right? So maybe that says more about where my mind is, but Homo sapiens. So they thought that it had coexisted with Homo sapiens, and so it became this kind of Tolkienian multi-species, and this evidence of a multi-species prehistoric.
Convivencia.
Yeah, convivencia. Yeah, that's right, a kind of a prehistoric convivencia. But then it turned out that they had just misdated it, and it was much, much older, so that story fell apart. But at the moment of discovery, it was this kind of incredibly exciting moment that brought the ancient world into this kind of consonance with the Tolkien kind of fantasy Middle Ages. It was very strange.
And we haven't talked about it, but one of the things Louise does mention in the book is that while it is amusing, and you can totally see why the scientists ran with Homo hobbitus, it really did elide a lot about where this body was found, so there was a real erasure going on.
Yeah. And also, yeah, there was, because again, it comes back to that question of what does it mean to take a Southeast Asian Paleolithic female set of bones and Europeanise them, masculinise them, and make them white, as it were. And I think the other thing about it is that this was a time that when the bones were found, this was a time when Australia and Indonesia were not particularly friendly with each other. It had come after the Bali bombings, and so there was a lot of tension between Australian and Indonesian archaeologists, and so it just became a kind of again like a lightning rod. And so I was just interested in this curious case study where the medieval just captured a whole series of tensions. And even though it is a really idiosyncratic and, as you say, quite kind of comic at one level episode, it also just, for me, captures the way in which the medieval constantly becomes this collection point for all of these sorts of unexpected tensions and unexpected ambitions and commitments and anxieties. And I find that the medieval constantly attracts these energies to it, and why, when you were saying before about Stimmung and this idea that the medieval attracts kind of affect and mood rather than sort of direct historical, pursuits.
And that in its strangeness, it's proximate enough to make really illegible things a bit more legible.
Yeah.
But because it retains the quality of strangeness, it still enables something like the skeleton to hold on to its otherness.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very weird. It's a weird story, but I felt it was one that told us quite a lot about what work the medieval does culturally in the modern world.
Imagine if they'd called it Homo hobitus. I mean, that would just, anyway. Sorry, I should...
Yeah.
We've got no more questions online that I can see. Is there another question from the floor? We've got time for one more.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot like the fantastical nature of the medieval in like contemporary like fiction and stuff like that. But what is the perspective of that from a medieval scholar? Like when that happens, is it something that is good? Is it bad? Like if you're the existence of the fact that like there's so many stories that use the Middle Ages as a vehicle for fantasy. Is it? I mean, like what's the opinion?
Do you mean like how do medieval scholars respond to it? Oh yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think that medievalism studies, which is what this book is emerging out of, has a kind of an interesting relationship to medieval studies. So there are those of us who like me, who want to say that even medieval scholarship is a form of medievalism, right? Because I think that the idea that scholars can ever kind of fully separate out their own kind of disposition to the past, including emotional dispositions to the past, I sort of think that all scholarship, all approaches to the Middle Ages carry in them in some way, not so much like inaccuracies, but a kind of a sense of relationship to the past that's never just fully empirical. But I think that a lot of medieval scholars, I think, have kind of embraced medievalism and have recognised that that whenever we're dealing with that period, we're also dealing with a long afterlife of perception and misperception about it. And most people just kind of recognise, I think, these days that that this is the part of reckoning with the period is reckoning with its legacy. Some people then react and say, well, we have to kind of, we have to get past those inaccuracies. And I think in particular, people are anxious about inaccuracies when they see those inaccuracies basically being weaponised. And when I was using the example before of some of the right-wing thought that's taken up the Middle Ages and used a kind of a conception of, a totally white Christian patriarchal Middle Ages in a way that then kind of fetishizes that period and then sort of says this is the lost past to which we must return. A number of medievalists have then kind of come in and said, well, we need to look more carefully and more accurately at the kind of linguistic, religious and racial, sort of racially mixed and sort of interactive world of the Middle Ages as a way of kind of correcting that error, and not just correcting that error, but attempting to kind of short circuit the kinds of weaponised politics that come with that. So I think it's actually a really hard question to answer, because I think there's such a range of responses. Some people get very defensive of accuracy and say medievalism over there, proper, accurate, empirical views of the Middle Ages over here, and let's keep those apart. Others recognise that we're always kind of having to reflect on our own investments in the period as we engage with it, and others will be quite comfortable with anachronism. I know we have somebody in the room, Steph, who's been working really interestingly on anachronism, but thinking thoughtfully about it and recognising that we can't just embrace anachronism and embrace inaccuracy without kind of thinking about a kind of a sense of responsibility to the past as well. So I think there's a real range of views about it.
Yeah, I think, and I also, just to answer your question, the stakes have really changed since 9/11 as well, in terms of how the medieval has been weaponised.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
Somebody who may have felt a certain way about it 30 years ago or whatever, the entire field of medievalism and medieval studies have had to deal with medievalism in a different sort of way, because it has been weaponised in quite new ways.
Became an instrument of Islamophobia, and so people just really had to kind of stand back and go, what does it mean to take up an idea of a past that allows you to do things in the present that are damaging? So yeah, and I'm absolutely right. It was a very, very galvanising moment, 9/11, for our field.
At that point, you've done exceptionally well. The clock has just ticked over to 5 o'clock, so very, very well done.
We like time. We think about time
it's
a lot.
An absolutely incredible achievement. That was just an inspiring hour of discussion. Could we please put our hands together and raise our little applause for Louise and Clare? Bravo. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for coming, especially in week one. And to Andrew and to Mike Baber, our technical wizard, for organising this. And a reminder that the next seminar, to which you're all very welcome, is on Wednesday the 24th of August, and will be with another excellent colleague, Associate Professor Kate Rossmann,